In this session, we will learn the proper method for entering and processing General Ledger transactions. First, we go to the General Ledger menu and we select Transactions. We now see the General Ledger transaction window. On the left-hand side of the window, we see batches we have created, which we will use to enter transactions into the system. Batches can be updated using the Add, Change, and Delete buttons located underneath the list box.
To add or change a batch, click either the Add or Change button,
and the Batch Edit window will come into view. The system will allow you to give your batch an ID number, a user ID, and a description. Here you can specify whether this is a repeating batch. Transactions in repeating batches will not be deleted during posting. This means you can post the same batch of transactions again at a later time. If this is a repeating batch, you can indicate the frequency with which the transactions in the batch are to be repeated. For example, I might indicate that this batch repeats with a frequency of 1 month. When I post the transactions in this batch, an unposted copy of each transaction will be saved in the batch for later processing. The dates of all these new transactions will be increased by 1 month. The system will also display the date the transactions were last posted from this batch. On the right-hand side of the window, there's a list box that shows the different transaction groups that have been currently entered into the highlighted batch.
In order to add a new group of transactions into this batch, we click the Add button.
The system now displays a window which allows for a number of transaction line items to be posted to the General Ledger. All these transactions will share a common fiscal period and journal ID, shown here at the top of the window. The default journal ID for transactions entered here in Transaction Entry is G/J, which stands for General Journal. In very rare cases, you could choose a different journal ID from the drop-down list box. Transactions can share a common transaction date, although the date can be changed as each transaction is entered. The system also asks if it should automatically assign a journal number during the posting. Postings that are created automatically in other modules such as Accounts Payable and Payroll are all assigned consecutive journal numbers by the system. In most cases, it's desirable to allow the system to automatically generate the journal number during posting. However, there may be some cases when you may wish to dictate what the journal number should be. For example, you may be appending a couple of transactions to the end of an existing posting and wish to use the same journal number. Once you've entered all the header information,
you can now add transactions to this transaction group. Clicking the Add button will display a window that allows us to enter our transaction.
Most transactions entered through this window will have a detail type of GL account. However, we could also apply our transaction to a job or a piece of equipment. For our first line item, we will charge to a General Ledger account.
We will use this button
to look up an account from the account list. I'm going to select the cash account. We can now enter a description of this transaction line item. Since this is a transaction to a checking account, the check number field is available for entering a check number. The transaction date defaults to the date entered on the previous window. Here we can enter the debit or credit amount of our transaction. We now click the OK button, and we see that the system has included our transaction line item in the list box and has added the line item amount to either the debit or credit total at the bottom of the window. We can now enter another transaction to offset the first one. All transaction groups that are input through this program should be balanced journal entries. In other words, the total credit amount should equal the total debit amount. Our second line item will default to line item number 2. We're going to charge this line item to a job. We'll select a valid job number and budgeted cost code. the system automatically pulls up the general ledger control account number associated with the cost code we selected. In this case, it's the account for labor expenses on jobs. The description will default to whatever we put in the description field for the previously entered line item. If we wish, we can change it and enter a different description for this line item. Since this line item is being charged to a job budget, we can enter a quantity. In the case of this labor cost code,
this quantity is the number of hours. Also, you can indicate whether these are regular or overtime hours.
We can now enter the debit or credit amount of this transaction. Since this transaction group is not currently in balance, the system gives us a button here that lets us finish off the group by automatically assigning the proper debit or credit amount to balance out the transaction group. We can click this button to easily finish off our entry. Now that we've put two line items into this transaction group, and we know we have an equal dollar amount of debits and credits, the system will allow us to click on the OK button and accept our general ledger transaction group. If the total debits and total credits of all the line items in our group are not equal, then when we attempt to click the OK button, the system will warn us that we have attempted to save an unbalanced transaction group. Now, there may be times when it's necessary to make an unbalanced entry, but these times are few and far between, and they do require that the user has a sufficient access level to enter and process unbalanced transactions.
There are a few buttons at the bottom of the window that provide some time-saving options. This button will reverse the signs of all the listed transactions. In other words, it will change all the debit amounts to credit amounts and all the credit amounts to debit amounts. This button lets you search for some previously posted transaction group. When you find the one you're looking for, it will create duplicates of all the line items in that transaction group and reverse the signs of each. This is a quick way of voiding a transaction posting you have done previously. The last button lets you transfer funds from one account to another. All it asks for is two account numbers and an amount. It will then create two transactions, one to credit the amount from the first account and one to debit the amount to the second account.
Now we see our group of transactions showing up in our batch. And we can see that the system lists the dollar amount of the total credits and total debits. Now we can enter more transaction groups into our batch, or we can continue with the processing of our transaction batch. These three buttons at the bottom of the window are the buttons that we use to do our transaction processing. The first button gives us the ability to change the dates and fiscal periods of the transactions in the highlighted batch. This is usually used only for repeating batches. Repeating batches are used to take care of such things as depreciation of fixed assets. You may want to put in a batch of depreciation entries, depreciating the value of all your fixed assets once per month, and make it a repeating batch, so that when you post, all the transactions remain in the batch, and all you need to do is change the dates and fiscal periods and continue processing. We can print a proof listing of our tagged batches by clicking this button. The system will then display the standard report window and allow us to change the report printing limits if we choose. Although usually on a proof listing, we will want to see all the transactions in the batch, so we won't set a limit on the report. This report shows all the transactions in all the groups in the tagged batches. To finish our process, we click the Post Tagged Batches button. The system will post all the transactions in all the groups in the tagged batches. Since we have already assigned a fiscal period during entry, we are not required to assign a fiscal period at this point of the posting process. We simply click the Post button. The system will post the tagged transaction batches and generate a posting report showing the posted transactions. We are then given one last chance to review the posting for accuracy If it is accurate, click the Finish button. Otherwise, click the Undo button, and the system data will return to the state it was in prior to the posting. You'll notice another entry button here for entering instant checks. Please review the training session on instant checks for instructions on using this feature. This concludes this training session on entering and processing transactions through the General Ledger system.